Alright, first we get a legal disclaimer. Can't escape these. Alright. Oh, now I gotta use my outside voice too. Thank you for participating in Garnet Valley Vietnam-era Oral History Project. This project seeks to gather information about personal experiences of people in our community during the Vietnam War. This project is being conducted by students as part of the coursework in Advanced Placement United States History. By signing the form below or agreeing to it audibly, you give your permission to share any recording of our interview made during the Oral History Project with the course teachers Mr. Lehman and Mr. Brangle, who may use it for educational purposes only. If you have any questions, please contact Keith Lehman at 610-579-7437 or email him at lehmank@garnetvalley.org. By giving your permission, you do not give up any copyright or performance rights that you may hold.
Fine.
Alright.
Agreed.
Man, a few words. Alright. First question. Introduction, like your name, what you did during the Vietnam War, like how old were you and all that.
My name is Artemis Hamilton. I'm 83. During the Vietnam War, I was going to night school most of the time and working during the day. Vietnam War didn't start until after I had been in and out of the regular army. And so my involvement in the Vietnam War was whatever I saw on the news and read about in the newspaper.
Now, since you went to night school, if you went to college, obviously, you could avoid the draft. By going to night school, did you avoid the draft?
No. First off, in 1961, when I went in for my free induction physical,
Yeah.
there were no exemptions. When I ultimately got to my basic training, the very first weekend, they signed a law that married men were exempt from the draft. Prior to that, there were no exemptions. Unfortunately, I was already there, so I ended up staying for my duration of 6 months, and then ultimately went into the reserves.
All right, so when did you first become aware of the Vietnam War and what was happening there?
When I was leaving after my stay in the regular army, talking to one of the drill sergeants, and he said he'd just come back from Vietnam, and he was one of about 10 U.S. soldiers, at least in that area where he was. So that was the first that I really understood what was going on there. Prior to that, I remember seeing a picture about a place called Dien Bien Phu, which was where the French were fighting the Viet Cong, or which became the Viet Cong, in probably the 1950s. So that really was the first I saw it.
All right. When did you first become aware of why we're in Vietnam, and what were your views on the motives?
Probably first became aware of it in 1963, maybe 62. It was a long time ago. The stated motives were that if they didn't stop the communists there, then through the domino theory that was promoted, that the entire Southeast Asia and ultimately the whole world would become communist. So they had to go into the Vietnam in the war and fight North Vietnam to stop communism from spreading throughout the world. What did I think of the motives? It sounded good at the time. However, as time went on, it became apparent to me that was just a story that the government was telling to justify the war.
Yeah. Now, how do you feel the war was portrayed by the media throughout the war?
From the media, it was good. Unfortunately, all the news, or the bulk of the news that you saw on the media, had to do with how many troops were dying and how it was not becoming a successful war. But it was really the first war that was covered on television. Prior to that, like I lived through the Korean War and I lived through, as a very small child, through the Second World War, there was no television. So maybe if there would have been television back in 1940s, then maybe would have been more coverage. So.
Do you think that like media portrayal got like worse over time? Like it started out like how you viewed it, like it started out sounding good, and then like media just got worse and worse.
As time went on, they became more critical and less rah-rah about the war. What you saw on that I remember seeing on the thing. The thing to remember was every night when you watched. Of course, there was only the 6 o'clock news back then. But every night when you watched the news, probably the first 5 or 10 minutes of the news was the body count. How many U.S. troops were killed and how many Vietcong troops were killed.
You don't have to worry about that.
And I'm sure they included South Vietnam troops, but it was more about how many people were, the body bags, how many people were being killed.
What do you remember about our political leaders and their views on the war, and did you agree with them?
No.
Oh, couldn't hear.
Well, say that again now?
Yeah. What do you remember about political leaders and their views on the war, and did you agree with them?
No, because it became very apparent very, very quickly that it was somebody behind the scenes had an axe to grind, or they weren't telling us the truth about why the war was going on.
How did you feel about prominent figures who protested the war?
Actually, I agreed with them. Some of them were a little radical, I'm sure. But I mean, that was another aspect of the thing covered. You know, when you watched the 6 o'clock news or you read the newspaper, a good portion of it was the actual war, what was going on in Vietnam, and another good portion, if not the rest of the news, was the protests that were going on.
Any specific protests that you remember, like Kent State?
I remember Kent State at the time, which I thought was horrible. But do I remember any of the specific protests? No, just that they were every day, it seemed like.
All right. And leading into that one, how did you feel about the anti-war movement, and did those views change over time?
Well, only because as time went on, it became apparent to a lot of people that the war should not have been going on, should not have been started. But once the U.S. was in, you really couldn't get out.
Yeah. Now, how do you feel about the ways Vietnam has been represented by pop culture today?
Well, it's like it almost never happened. All the bad things that happened were kind of forgotten, or now glossed over. I was just looking at something that we recently bought, and it said "Made in Vietnam," and I was aware of what's been going on in Vietnam in the intervening years, but it kind of struck home that when I was a kid, the if something was made in Japan, it was marked made in occupied Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And now things are made in Indonesia, or China, and Vietnam, like it's over and done with.
Yeah. Now, what do you think about the Vietnam Memorial, and have you been to it?
I think it's good. I have been to it. We were down in Washington. Kids were just like when your parents were just kids.
Yeah.
And I remember walking along the memorial. But I look at it the same as when I go to memorials in Gettysburg or
Mm-hmm.
you know or Arlington National Cemetery. So.
All right. Did you have people you knew who were drafted into war?
My brother, I knew a lot of guys that
Mm-hmm.
went into the war, guys that I went to high school with, and but I kind of lost track of people that were my friends. But
Yeah.
but yeah, like my brother went in and he was in Vietnam. My younger brother.
Did he volunteer, or was he drafted?
I believe he volunteered for the draft. You could do that back then. So if you went in for the draft, you went in for 2 years. If you enlisted, it was dependent on the service, 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
But you could volunteer for the draft, which is like enlisting, but you're only tied up for 2 years.
Yeah. Do you remember what his time was like there at all?
He was so much younger than me, but and he was not in the jungles. He was in, from what I remember, either a support unit or a artillery unit of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, did you write often? Like, how did you communicate with him? Obviously, writing letters.
I communicated with our mother,
Mm-hmm.
and she would pass on information to me.
And how often would you hear from him?
Not very often, as I remember, not very often.
Did he have to describe how his experience was, like, after war?
Yeah, I don't think he's ever talked about it. At least not to me.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the public view of citizens who were not being drafted?
I don't think anybody was not being drafted unless they had a deferment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think generally the consensus in the general public was if you had a deferment, it was a valid. So that was it. But the other thing is, because of news reports of a lot of drug use by the soldiers
Mm-hmm.
that may or may not be real, a lot of people had a negative view of the soldiers that were there. And that became a big problem.
Mm-hmm. And people who were like dodged draft by like moving Canada or something, were they seen differently?
Yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't know anybody who did,
Yeah.
but you'd see it in the news all the time, and I know it was a big thing. People would go up to Canada. Yeah.
And what was the atmosphere like in the country?
Strained. I mean, when every day the news is almost 100% the war in Vietnam, and it was all negative, and a lot of people were bummed out.
Mm-hmm. And how was civil rights influenced?
Well, it was going on about what we remember in the news about the same time. I guess depending on where you lived, certainly up here, people were certainly justified in protesting for civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
But when you went down south, it was a different story.
All right, so you're a chemist, right?
Yes.
How was your job affected by the Vietnam War? Did you like switch to making more chemicals for the military, or?
No. No, I worked for a subsidiary of Sun Oil, and we were developing polymers to be used to make plastics.
Mm-hmm.
Plastics hadn't, to that point, become everyday useful items, kind of a novelty.
Yeah.
And none of our development work was geared toward making anything for the military.
Mm-hmm. So Agent Orange, what do you know about that?
Well, I know what it is. It was used as a defoliant, and it was used indiscriminately. And I know that a lot of soldiers got exposed to it and were ultimately made sick. That's what ultimately killed my brother, who just died recently, who was in Vietnam. My older brother, who was in the military, stationed in Germany, he was a judge and a lawyer over there, and he was involved in a lot of military court cases involving Agent Orange.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought he still thinks it was more dangerous and rampant as far as problems it caused than what's being reported even today.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you feel like after the war, veterans had to fight for like more veterans' rights, for compensation for Agent Orange and all that? So, witnessing that, what was that kind of like?
Well, certainly I supported it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't, once the war was, let's say, over, or certainly all the troops were out,
Yeah.
these were just the normal things happening, in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And at the time, did you realize like how big of a deal like Agent Orange was? Like at that point, did you know of the side effects?
well, I knew, yes, I knew what it was, and and I know it was going to be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
Being a chemist, seeing some of the things in the literature, I recognized what was the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that the general populace really understood how much of a problem it was going to be,
Yeah.
because the guys who were exposed, they didn't get sick right away.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my brother was there in mid-1960s, maybe 67, 68, I'm thinking, and maybe 69, closer to 70 maybe even.
Mm-hmm.
And he really didn't get sick until the last 10 years of his life.
Yeah. Now, how did you feel about like American treatments of the Viet Cong and Vietnamese people in general?
Well, they were the enemy, so whatever they got, they deserved.
Mm-hmm. And did you have like any reservations, like the My Lai massacre, where they killed women, children, and just everybody in a village and burning villages? How did you feel about that?
Well, it shouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens when the troops who were involved get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And no matter whatever their supervisors did or said or could do,
Mm-hmm.
they, the guys just went crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So that happens. It's not the first place that's happened.
Yeah. Let's see. What was your favorite memory during this time?
I guess my favorite memory is when I was finally getting out of the reserves.
It doesn't have to be about. It could just be like anything. It doesn't have to be Vietnam.
No, but that was my favorite memory. I remember taking my oldest son, who was maybe a couple of years, 3 or 4 years old by then, 3 years old, when I went up to check out, turn in my gear and get discharged, and I remember seeing the first sergeant, who I really liked, but I walked my son up to him and I said to him, if you ever see this kid here, shoo him away. And I told my son, if you ever see this guy, don't go near him. But I was just joking around.
Yeah. And anything else that you want to add on?
Well, not really, other than it's funny, a lot of things like what you're doing now involve what happened in Vietnam, but I don't remember anything happening like this for the Korean War.
Yeah.
When I was going to night school, college, there was a lot of Korean War vets, guys who were maybe 10 years older than me, and I worked with a lot of Korean War vets.
Yeah.
And the stories that they described were horrible compared to, or at least equivalent to what you read on the news or heard on the news of Vietnam. And I'm sure the same thing happened in Second World War.
Yeah.
So
you think the Korean War was definitely not portrayed as well by the media? Portrayed better by the media than how it actually was.
I because there wasn't television, and it was really never declared as a war. It was a police action, and there's still not been any end to the war. There's an armistice.
Yeah.
So because of television, so much more coverage was given to the Vietnam War compared to Korean War.
Alright. That everything?
I guess.
Alright.